Some secrets are never spoken aloud. They are folded, sealed, passed from one pair of hands to another in the dead quiet of a corridor that smells of old stone and fresh polish. They live inside envelopes the color of cream, pressed flat by the weight of a crown that has not rested easy in decades. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person carrying that secret doesn't even know what they're holding until years later when the world has changed around them and the woman who wrote the words is gone. This is one of those stories. It doesn't begin with fanfare. It doesn't begin with a state occasion or a televised ceremony or the kind of moment that ends up framed on a museum wall. It begins the way most things that matter begin, quietly, unremarkably, in a hallway. A man in uniform, a woman in a headscarf, and a pair of sensible shoes. A folded note. 3 words spoken so softly they barely disturbed the air. The man's name was James Lawrence. He had been a grenadier guard for 11 years by the time it happened. 11 years of standing still while the world moved. 11 years of learning to see everything and show nothing, to keep his eyes fixed on a middle distance that existed nowhere in particular, to breathe so evenly that he might have been mistaken for a very well-dressed statue on the coldest mornings in London. He was good at his job the way a river is good at flowing, without trying, without drama, without any particular desire for recognition. He was 34 years old. He had a flat in Balham he shared with a cat named Gordon after Gordon Banks, because James had supported Leicester City since before it was fashionable to do so and had never once apologized for it. He rang his mother on Sundays. He made a reasonable bolognese. He had a scar on his left palm from a glass that broke wrong during a New Year's Eve that he didn't talk about. He was, in every way that mattered to the people who filled out personnel forms, an ordinary man doing an extraordinary job in the most ordinary way possible. And that was exactly why she chose him. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in October, which meant the sky over London was doing its usual impression of a ceiling that needed repainting, flat gray, faintly threatening, the kind of sky that makes you check your pockets for your travel card before you've even had breakfast. James had arrived at his post at 6:45, which was 15 minutes earlier than required, because he had never in 11 years been anything less than 15 minutes early. It was not ambition. It was just how he was built. The household was quieter than usual that morning. There was a quality to the silence that James had learned to read the way a fisherman reads water. Not what it was, but what it meant. This silence meant something had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. The kind of shift you feel in the air pressure before the weather decides what it wants to be. He didn't ask questions. That was not what he was there to do. At 9:10, a senior aide appeared at the end of the corridor where James was posted. The aide, a man named Fellows who wore his suits like they had been issued to him along with his job, and his careful, neutral expression, walked toward James at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual. The pace of a man delivering something that mattered. He stopped 2 feet away. He held out an envelope. The envelope was cream-colored, small, the kind of thing that might hold a folded card or a brief letter. It was sealed. On the front, in handwriting that James did not yet know well enough to recognize for what it was, there was a name and an address written in blue ink. The handwriting was not the careful penmanship of someone performing neatness. It was the handwriting of someone who had written 10,000 letters and no longer needed to think about the shape of the letters, only the weight of the words. She'd like this delivered personally, Fellows said. By hand. Today. James looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up yet. Post. No. By hand. Fellows' expression did not change. She was specific. James picked up the envelope. It was lighter than he expected, lighter than the moment felt. He turned it over. The seal on the back was plain. No crest, which he noted without comment. The name on the front was a woman's name. An address in Windsor. I'm on shift until arrangements have been made, Fellows said, and that was the end of that. He said nothing else. He turned and walked back the way he had come, at the same pace, with the same neutral face, and was gone around a corner before James had fully processed that the conversation was over. James stood with the envelope in his hand. It was light, cream-colored, sealed without a crest. He had been a grenadier guard for 11 years. He had stood at attention during state funerals and garden parties and the kinds of formal occasions where history walked through the room like it owned the place. He had watched world leaders pass within arm's reach of him and kept his eyes on that middle distance nowhere. He had been trained to be unmoved. He put the envelope carefully into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. He didn't know why he chose that pocket over any other. He just did. He left the palace at 10:35 on a Tuesday in October, carrying something he didn't yet understand, heading toward an address he'd never visited, on behalf of a woman he was not supposed to look at directly. The drive to Windsor took him through traffic that was doing its aggressive London best. Cabs pulling out without signaling, a lorry blocking half of a roundabout, pedestrians making their peace with death at crossings. James drove a 10-year-old Vauxhall that had a heating system with opinions and a radio that picked up only 2 stations clearly, one of which was a classical station and one of which played the same 5 pop songs from 2009 in rotation. He listened to neither. He drove in silence. The envelope sat in his inside breast pocket the whole way. He had not opened it. He would not open it. This was not something he decided consciously. It was simply not a thing that occurred to him as a possibility. The envelope was not his to open. He was not its author or its recipient. He was the space between those 2 people, the negative space, the medium through which the message moved. That was what he was. He had always understood his role this way, even before he had words for it. The house in Windsor was a semi-detached on a residential street that looked exactly like the kind of street where nothing interesting ever happened, which was, James had learned, precisely where the most interesting things tended to happen. Roses in the front garden, slightly past their season. A wheelie bin that someone had forgotten to bring back in. A wind chime that was doing its best against a sky that didn't care. He knocked. The woman who answered was in her 70s, small, with white hair pulled back, and the kind of eyes that had been watching people long enough to stop being surprised by them. She looked at James, his uniform, his height, the careful blankness of his expression, and something happened in her face that was not quite recognition and not quite shock. It was the thing between those 2 things. "Yes," she said, before he had spoken. James reached into his breast pocket. He retrieved the envelope with both hands. He held it out. She took it the same way, 2 hands, like something that needed to be held properly. "She wrote it herself?" the woman asked. "I was told it was to be delivered personally," James said. "By hand." The woman looked down at the envelope, at the handwriting on the front. She did not open it there at the door. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "No, thank you," James said. "I should get back." She nodded. She looked up at him one more time. Her eyes were doing something he couldn't name, something that lived in the neighborhood of grief, but was not quite grief. Something older. "Tell her," the woman said, and then stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She looked down at the envelope again. "It's all right," she said instead. "Thank you." James nodded. He turned. He walked back to his 10-year-old Vauxhall with the opinionated heating system and the limited radio. He got in. He sat for a moment in the parked car on that quiet residential street with the slightly past-season roses and the forgotten wheelie bin. He started the engine. He drove back to London. He did not know on that drive back what the note said. He did not know who the woman at the door was to the woman who had written it, what history existed between them, what weight those few folded words were carrying across a distance that was not only geographical. He did not know that he would think about this afternoon for the rest of his life. Not obsessively, not with longing, but with the specific, low hum of the thing that mattered without announcing itself. He knew only that the envelope was no longer in his breast pocket, and that the space where it had rested felt, for reasons he could not explain to himself or anyone else, like something had been completed. He was back at his post by 2 o'clock. The sky had made up its mind and started raining. Nobody asked him how it went. Later, much later, in a way that later tends to work, arriving years after the fact without warning, he would try to describe that afternoon to people who asked him about his time in service. He would start the story and find, partway through, that the part he most wanted to convey was the weight of the envelope, which was, as he had noted at the time, almost nothing, lighter than he expected. He could never explain why that was the part that stayed with him. The lightness of it. The absolute, specific lightness of a few words from one woman to another, crossing a city in the inside pocket of a man who would never know what they said, carried carefully, delivered whole, received with two hands. He would stop there, usually, and whoever was listening would wait for the rest, and he would shake his head slightly, and that would be the end of it, because that was the whole story. That was all of it, except that it wasn't. Not yet. There was still the woman who had opened the door, still the look on her face when she recognized the handwriting, still the sentence she had started and chosen not to finish, standing in her doorway with the wind chime doing its best behind her. And there was still the morning, 3 weeks after the delivery, when a different aide appeared at the end of the corridor where James was posted. Not Fellows this time, someone younger, with the expression of a person who has been asked to convey something without knowing what it means, and handed James a small card. The card was cream-colored. The handwriting on it was the same. 2 words. He read them once. He put the card in his inside breast pocket. He returned his gaze to the middle distance nowhere. He stood very still. He breathed evenly. He did not show anything on his face. That was the job. That was always the job. But inside the still, even expressionless space of him, something had shifted. Not broken, shifted, the way the silence in the household had shifted on that gray Tuesday morning, when the sky couldn't decide what it wanted, and an envelope changed hands in a corridor that smelled of old stone and fresh polish. The 2 words on the card were, "Thank you." That was all. No signature. None was needed. He kept the card for the rest of his life. It lived in a small wooden box on the shelf above his desk in the flat in Balham, next to a photograph of Gordon Banks making the save, and a broken watch he kept meaning to get repaired. He never showed it to anyone. He never talked about it in detail. Some things are not for telling. Some things are for keeping, the way you keep a stone you picked up on a particular beach. Not because the stone is valuable, but because of everything that was happening inside you the moment you picked it up, and the way the stone, held in the palm, gives all of that somewhere to live. He had done something simple on a gray Tuesday in October. He had carried a thing carefully from one place to another and delivered a whole. And for that, someone had said thank you. And for that, he had been, without any fuss or drama or announcement, completely undone. The wooden box sat on the shelf for 7 years before anyone noticed it. Not because James hid it, he didn't. He was not a man who hid things. He was a man who kept things in their place, which is a different behavior entirely, even if it produces the same result from the outside. The box was simply there, the way Gordon Banks was there in the photograph next to it, mid-dive, hands spread, the whole of his body committed to an act that everyone watching already knew would succeed. You stopped seeing it after a while. It became part of the shelf the way the shelf was part of the flat, the way the flat was part of Balham, the way Balham was part of the city that James moved through every day without looking at it anymore. 7 years is a long time. Things happen in 7 years. James was no exception. He left the Grenadier Guards in 2016, which was the year that everything else was also leaving something. The country leaving Europe, Leicester City leaving their position at the bottom of the league table, and arriving, inexplicably at the top of it, the particular version of the world that everyone had grown up assuming was permanent, quietly folding itself away. James left the Guards with a handshake, a certificate, and a pension that was adequate without being comfortable, which was more than most things in life managed to be. He was 41. He had good knees, no debt, and no particular plan. He did what men with good knees and no plan tend to do. He walked a lot. He found a job in security at a hospital in Tooting, which paid the bills and asked very little of him emotionally, which suited him. He still rang his mother on Sundays. He still made a reasonable bolognese. Gordon the cat had died in 2014 at the age of 17, which had affected James more than he told anyone. And he had not replaced him, not because he didn't want a cat, but because he didn't want a different cat. There's a distinction there that takes a certain kind of person to understand. He was in the way that the years after a significant job often are, quietly adrift. Not miserable, not lost, just adrift. The way a boat is adrift when the anchor has been lifted and the destination hasn't been chosen yet, and The current is mild enough that nobody's panicking, but the shore is getting no closer either. The wooden box sat on the shelf. The card inside it had not moved. The woman who noticed the box was named Patricia Osei. She was a nurse at the hospital, and she had the specific brand of directness that comes from spending 12-hour shifts talking to people who are frightened and need things explained clearly and without fuss. She had been working the same ward as James's security post for 3 months before she spoke to him about anything other than the location of the visitor's lift and whether the break room kettle was working. Not because she was unfriendly. She was very friendly in the brisk, functional way of someone who genuinely likes people but has too much to do to perform it constantly. She simply hadn't had a reason to talk to him until the evening his phone screen cracked when he dropped it, and she happened to be walking past, and she said, without breaking her stride, "There's a place on Tooting High Street. They do it while you wait. Tell them Patty sent you. They'll knock off a $5." And James, who had been staring at his cracked screen with the expression of a man calculating whether the crack was a problem yet, looked up and said, "Right. Thank you." And Patricia said, "Don't thank me. Thank the fact that I've broken 3 of these things and had to become an expert." And James almost smiled. That was October 2017. By December, they were having dinner. Not at restaurants. Neither of them was interested in restaurants, which they discovered when James suggested one. And Patricia said she'd rather just come to his, and they could cook. And James said fine, he had a bolognese. And Patricia said she'd bring rice because pasta gave her migraines. So she came to the flat in Balham, and they made dinner together in a kitchen that was too small for 2 people to be comfortable in, but was exactly the right size for 2 people to be unavoidable to each other, which is sometimes better. James made the bolognese. Patricia made the rice. They ate at the small table by the window and talked about the hospital and Leicester City and her family in Accra and his mother in Coventry and why Gordon the cat had been named after Gordon Banks, which she found genuinely delightful and told him was the most specific form of grief she had encountered outside of a clinical setting. After dinner, she stood at the shelf looking at things. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing at the photograph. "Gordon Banks. The cat. The goalkeeper. The cat was named after him." She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then, her eyes moved to the box. "What's in there?" James looked at the box. He had not looked at it directly, not consciously, in a long time. He knew it was there the way he knew his left palm had a scar from a glass that broke wrong on a New Year's Eve. Present, real, not examined. "A card," he said. "Just a card. Just a card." Patricia looked at him. She had the kind of eyes that had been watching people long enough to stop being surprised by them. James noticed this, and noticed that it reminded him of something and couldn't immediately place what. "Okay," she said, and moved on to look at the broken watch he kept meaning to get repaired. That was all. She didn't push. That was one of the things about her that James would later identify. When he was trying to explain to himself why she mattered, she had a perfect sense of which doors to leave closed. She understood, without being told, that a closed door was not always a locked one. Sometimes it was just closed because it hadn't been the right time yet. The right time came 4 months later, in February, when the news broke. James was on his day off. He was sitting with a cup of tea, watching nothing in particular on television, when the newsreader's tone changed in the specific way that it changes when something significant has happened. Not a catastrophe, but a wait. He turned the volume up. The announcement was about health, about a period of reduced public engagements, about doctors' recommendations. The language was careful, diplomatic, the kind of language that is designed to convey information while leaving the full weight of it for the listener to assemble themselves. James sat with his cup of tea and listened. He did not move for a long time after. Not because he was shocked. He was 53. He had watched enough of the world move to understand that the things you assumed were permanent were only permanent in the way that a very long sentence is, right up until the full stop. He moved because his tea had gone cold. He got up and stood in his kitchen and looked at the kettle without switching it on. Then he walked to the shelf. He picked up the wooden box. He opened it. The card was still there, cream-colored. the handwriting slightly faded but legible. 2 words. He stood holding the box in both hands, the same way the woman in Windsor had held the envelope, he realized. 2 hands, like something that needed to be held properly. He thought about that Tuesday in October. The corridor smelling of old stone and polish. The weight of the envelope, lighter than the moment felt. The woman at the door and the sentence she had started and not finished. The drive back through London traffic with the empty pocket and the specific sense of completion. He thought about the card arriving 3 weeks later. The younger aide who didn't know what he was carrying. Reading the 2 words once, then putting the card in his breast pocket and returning his gaze to the middle distance nowhere. He thought about why he had kept it. Not as a trophy, he was not that kind of man. Not as proof, he had needed no proof. As a stone from a particular beach. As a thing that gave him moments somewhere to live. He put the box down on the kitchen table. He called Patricia. "Can you come over?" he said. "I'm working until 7. After 7, there was a pause. She had heard something in his voice, the thing that wasn't distress, but was adjacent to it. "Okay," she said. "No fuss. No performance. Just okay." She arrived at 7:40 with Ghanaian takeaway in a plastic bag because she said he sounded like a man who needed soup, and she was right, though he hadn't known it yet. They sat at the small table by the window and ate, and then James got up and brought the wooden box from the kitchen shelf and put on the table between them. Patricia looked at it. She didn't touch it. "The card," she said. "Yes. Do you want to tell me about it?" And he did. He told her about the Tuesday in October and the corridor and fellows appearing with the envelope. He told her about the drive to Windsor and the woman at the door and the way she had held the envelope in 2 hands. He told her about the sentence she hadn't finished. He told her about the drive back and the space in his breast pocket and being back at his post by 2 o'clock in the rain. He told her about the card arriving 3 weeks later. He told her about the 2 words. Patricia listened the way she listened to frightened patients, without interrupting, without composing her response while he was still talking, without signaling that she already understood or that he was taking too long. She just listened. When he finished, she said, "You never told anyone." "No. Why not?" James thought about this. He looked at the box on the table between them. "It wasn't mine to tell," he said. "It was hers to write, and hers to receive." He paused. "I was just the space in between." Patricia looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was doing something complicated and quiet. "James," she said, "that is not nothing. What you did. I drove to Windsor and knocked on a door. You carried something private and important for a woman who could have sent it any number of other ways and chose not to. She chose a person. She chose you to put her hands on." Patricia's voice was calm, factual, the voice she used when she was saying something she needed him to actually hear. "That's not nothing. That's a trust." James looked at the box. He had known that. He had known it on the drive back through London traffic. He had known it when he read the card. He had kept the card because he had known it. Not consciously, not in words, but in the way you know a thing that is true before you have a language for it. He had just never heard anyone else say it out loud. "She died this morning," he said. It was the first time he had said aloud. The words were flat and ordinary and completely inadequate, the way words for enormous things always are. Patricia reached across the table. She put her hand over his. Outside, Balham was doing its usual evening thing. Traffic, voices, a bus pulling away. The wind that came through the slightly open window smelled of rain that hadn't started yet. James left his hand where it was. "Open the box," Patricia said. "I know what's in it." "I know you do. Open it anyway." He opened the box. He took out the card. He held it, cream-colored, slightly faded, in 2 hands. Patricia leaned forward and read the 2 words. She sat back. "That's everything," she said. James nodded. It always had been. He had just needed 7 years, a cracked phone screen, a woman who understood which doors to leave closed, and a morning when the news changed the shape of everything to understand it fully. He put the card back in the box. He closed the lid. He left the box on the table. He didn't put it back on the shelf that night. He let it stay where it was, in the open, in the light. The rain started. They listened to it hit the window. Patricia was right. It was everything. 2 words from a woman who had spent a lifetime saying the right things at the right times in the right rooms, choosing, for this particular thing, to say it small and private and specific, not to the country, not to the press, to one woman in Windsor via one man in a corridor, and then 3 weeks later to the man himself. Thank you. James thought about the woman at the door. The sentence she hadn't finished. Tell her, and then the pause, and then the pivot to it's all right. He had wondered for 7 years what the end of that sentence was. What she had started to say and chosen not to, whether it was something emotional, something that needed to stay unspoken, because speaking it would have made it too heavy to hold. He thought he understood now. Tell her she didn't have to. That was what the woman in Windsor had been going to say. Tell her she didn't have to do this. Send a man to my door with a handwritten note. Take the time, take the care, make it personal and private when she had 10,000 things demanding her attention and a country full of people who needed her in ways that didn't leave room for this. Tell her she didn't have to. She did it anyway. That was the note's real content, not the words inside. Those were between 2 women and always would be. The note itself, the act of it, the choosing of a specific man to carry it personally to a specific door. That was the message. I see you. I'm thinking of you. Not as a queen, just as a woman who knew you once and hasn't forgotten. James sat with this in his chest and let it settle. Outside, the rain was steady now. Balaam was quieter. The bus had gone. Patricia said nothing. She understood, correctly, that this was not a moment that needed filling. James reached across the table and covered her hand with his this time. That was all. That was enough. 3 years after Patricia put her hand over his at the kitchen table in Balaam, James Lawrence stood in a church in Coventry at his mother's funeral and did not cry. This was not unusual for him. He had cried twice in his adult life. Once when Gordon the cat died because he had been alone, and the flat had felt the specific way that a space feels when something that was alive in it is suddenly not, and once, though he would never have admitted it, on the drive back from Windsor in October, sitting in his parked Vauxhall on a quiet residential street with the slightly past-season roses before he started the engine. Both times he had been alone. Both times it had happened before he fully understood it was happening, which is the only way crying worked for men built the way James was built. In the church in Coventry, surrounded by his mother's friends and his cousins he only saw at these occasions, and a vicar who had never met his mother and was doing his best with the information he had been given, James stood very still and breathed evenly and looked at the middle distance nowhere. Old habits. His mother's name had been Margaret. She had been 78 years old. She had made the best pie crust in Coventry for 50 years and been very clear about the fact that she knew it. She had called James every Sunday for 11 years of his service to ask whether he was eating properly and whether he had a girlfriend and whether the Queen ever waved at him specifically, which he had always told her no, and which had always disappointed her in a way she made no effort to conceal. She had been small and direct and occasionally ruthless and deeply unsentimental loving. The kind of love that shows up in the form of pie and phone calls rather than declarations. He missed her in the way you miss a sound you've been hearing so long you stop noticing it, and only understand what it was when the silence arrives. Patricia stood next to him in the church. She had been with him for 2.5 years by then. They did not live together. They had discussed it and agreed, without much drama, that they were both people who needed a certain amount of their own space and their own routines and their own specific silences, and that the flat in Balaam worked for James and the flat in Streatham worked for Patricia, and the distance between them was precisely the right size. It was, James had decided, the most functional relationship he had ever been in, which was not a romantic way to describe it, but was an accurate one, and accuracy mattered more to him than romance, which Patricia said was very on brand for him. She stood next to him in the church and did not try to hold his hand. She understood correctly that in public James was the still and even man, and that what he needed from her right now was not comfort, but presence. Just being there. The weight of someone who knew him standing close. After the service, after the food at his cousin Derek's house, where the same 5 conversations happened simultaneously in different corners, after the drive back down the M6 with Patricia asleep in the passenger seat, and the classical station coming in clean for once. After all of that, they came back to the flat in Balham and sat in the kitchen, and James made tea without being asked, and Patricia did not suggest that he talk about it. He looked at the shelf. The wooden box was there. It had been back on the shelf since the morning after the night Patricia had first asked about it. He had moved it back the next day, early, before she woke up. Not to hide it, just to put it in its place. But it was a different kind of place now. He could see it directly. I want to write to someone, James said. Patricia looked at him. Okay. The woman in Windsor. I don't know if she's still there. I don't even know her name. He turned his tea mug in his hands. But I don't know. Tell her something. Tell her what? James thought about this. He had been thinking about it. He realized since the church, since standing in his mother's funeral and looking at the middle distance nowhere and thinking about the things that get passed between people quietly without ceremony and what those things do inside the person who receives them. That it mattered, he said. What she did, receiving the letter, saying what she said to me at the door. He paused. She said it's all right, and I didn't know what she meant at the time. I thought she was just being polite, releasing me. He looked at the mug, but she wasn't. She was saying it's all right about something specific, something in the letter, something she'd been waiting to hear. Patricia was quiet, and I've been thinking, James said, about my mom, about all the things I didn't say because I assumed there'd be time. He stopped. He started again. She used to ask if the Queen ever waved at me, and I always said no. And that was true. But something did happen. Something was given to me, and I never told her. Because it wasn't. He stopped again. Mine to tell, Patricia said. Right. And now? James looked at the box on the shelf. I think, he said slowly, that some things become yours to carry forward after enough time has passed. Not to own, not to claim, just to, he didn't have the word. Witness, Patricia said. He looked at her. To witness, he said. He wrote the letter the next evening, in the kitchen, longhand, on plain paper, because he didn't own notepaper, and couldn't bring himself to buy any specifically for this, because that felt performative. He wrote 2 drafts. The first one was too long, and explained too much, and contained a sentence about his mother's pie crust that he cut, because it belonged in a different letter. The second one was 4 paragraphs. It said what it needed to say. He addressed it to the woman in Windsor, the street, no name, on the grounds that whoever lived there now would either know who it was for or will be able to figure it out. He posted it on a Thursday morning on his way to the hospital. He dropped it in the post box on Tooting High Street, outside the phone repair shop where Patty sent you, and they knocked off a $5. He didn't expect a reply. He got one, 6 weeks later, in a small cream-colored envelope with a Windsor postmark and handwriting he didn't recognize. The woman in Windsor was still there. She had been in that house for 43 years. She had received James's letter and read it twice, and then she wrote, gone, and made a cup of tea and sat with it. She told him her name, Eleanor Marsh. She had known the woman who wrote the note through a shared connection that she described only as a long friendship, which James understood was all he was going to be told, and was all he needed. She told him that the note had arrived on a morning when she had badly needed it. She told him that she had wondered, sometimes, about the man who delivered it, whether he'd known what he was carrying, whether it had mattered to him at all. She told him that she was glad to know it had. She told him that the sentence she had started at the door, tell her, had been going to be tell her I'll write back. And she had. She had written back. And there had been, she said, a brief and private correspondence after that, which she would not detail, but which had been for her a very great gift. She ended the letter simply. She thanked him for writing. She said she hoped he was well. She signed it Eleanor. James read the letter sitting at the kitchen table. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and sat for a while with the specific feeling of a thing completing itself. Not ending, completing. The way a chord completes itself when a last note is played. You realize, only when it's finished, how long it was being built. He called Patricia. She wrote back, he said. There was a pause. Patricia knew exactly what he meant. Tell me, she said. He told her. He read her the parts he could without stopping. His voice at one point did something that he decided not to investigate too closely. Patricia listened. When he finished, she said, so she got her letters. She got her letters. And now you have yours. James looked at the letter on the table. Cream-colored. Handwriting he didn't recognize, but would now know. A name, Eleanor. After years of a nameless woman at a door with a sentence she'd almost spoken. Yes, he said. Mean. He put the letter in the wooden box. Not the card. The card was already there, in its place where it had always been. He added the letter beside it. The two pieces of paper sat together in the box, connected by a decade and a door, and a woman who had believed that private things deserved private handling, and by two people on either end of a corridor who had each, in their own way, been given something they hadn't known they needed. He put the box back on the shelf. Gordon Banks was still there in the photograph. Still mid-dive. Hands spread. The whole of his body committed to an act that was going to succeed. James looked at the photograph for a moment. He thought about legacy, not the big public kind, the statues, the ceremonies, the plaques on walls and buildings you have to queue to enter. The other kind, the kind that moves in corridors and envelopes, and the inside breast pockets of men who know how to carry things carefully. The kind that sits in wooden boxes on shelves in flats and Balham. The kind that passes between two women through a third person who never knows the words, only the weight. The kind that says, asterisk, I see you. I'm thinking of you. You mattered enough that I picked up a pen and addressed an envelope and chose a specific person to carry it because I wanted it to arrive with the care it deserved. Asterisk the kind that says, asterisk, I didn't have to. I did it anyway. Asterisk that was what had been in the envelope. Not just words. That. The choosing. The care. The act of treating one small private thing as though it deserved the same attention as a state occasion. James thought about his mother asking every Sunday whether the Queen had ever waved at him specifically. He thought about always saying no. He thought, she didn't wave. She sent a letter. She sent it through me. And then she sent me a card. And both of those things were addressed to specific people because she understood, she had always apparently understood, that the world is full of people doing important things in the middle distance nowhere, keeping their faces still, breathing evenly, carrying the weight of other people's moments, and never mentioning it. And sometimes they deserve to be seen. He picked up his phone. He dialed his cousin Derek's number. Not because Derek was the person he was closest to in his family, but because Derek had been at the funeral, and Derek had a long memory, and Derek had known Margaret Lawrence since before James was born. Derek, he said when Derek picked up, about a story I've been sitting on for a while. I think it's time I told someone in the family. Derek said, about what? James looked at the wooden box on a shelf. About a Tuesday in October, he said, and an envelope, and a drive to Windsor. He heard Derek settle back in his chair. The particular creak of someone who has been offered something worth listening to, and knows it. Go on then, Derek said. James told the story. He started with the corridor that smelled of old stone and polish. He told it at the pace it deserved. No rushing, no skipping, the way you hold a card in two hands because some things need to be held properly. He told it all the way through, including the card and the box and Eleanor Marsh and the letter that had arrived 6 weeks ago and was sitting now in the box on the shelf. When he finished, Derek was quiet for a moment. Mom would have loved that, Derek said. I know, James said. She would have told everyone. I know. Derek laughed, not a big laugh, a small one, the kind that sits at the edge of something else. She asked me once, whether she thought the Queen knew your name. James hadn't known that. He felt the thing that had been doing something in his chest take a shape he could almost name. What did you tell her, he asked. I said probably not, Derek said. Sorry about that. It's all right, James said. And he meant it. He meant it completely. His mother had asked whether the Queen knew his name, and the answer was almost certainly no. He was a man who had carried an envelope on a Tuesday. He was not a name. He was a function, a space in between, but something had passed through him that mattered. something private and specific, and human had moved from one person to another through his hands, and it had moved carefully, and it had arrived whole. And then it had come back to him in 2 words on a card that sat in a wooden box on a shelf in Balham. And now the story was moving again, through Derek, who would tell his wife, who would tell her sister, who would tell her children. Not as gossip, as the thing families carry forward when the people who made them are gone. The shape of who James Lawrence was. What he had done when he didn't have to. The care he had taken with a thing that wasn't his but had been given to him to hold for a little while. That was how legacy worked. Not in the announcements, in the telling, in the specific act of one person saying to another. Asterisk here is something true that happened. Put it somewhere safe. Asterisk James stood in his flat in Balham with his phone to his ear and looked at the wooden box on the shelf and understood, for the first time completely, why he had kept the card. Not as proof, not as memory, as a seed. Everything had grown from it. Eleanor's letter, the conversation with Patricia, the phone call to Derek, and wherever Derek's telling of it would go after this. The 2 words on the card had generated all of it. Thank you, and then the box, and then the years, and then the right person asking about it, and then the right moment to give it somewhere to live. That was what a thank you did when it was sincere, when it was specific, when it was delivered by hand. It didn't close a thing. It opened one. James said goodnight to Derek. He put the phone down. He went to the window and looked out at Balham, the street, the lights, a man walking a dog the size of a small furniture item, a bus pulling away with nobody left waiting for it. He thought about a woman in a headscarf and sensible shoes choosing a specific man to carry a specific letter because she believed the gesture deserved a human hand. He thought about Eleanor Marsh at her door, the wind chime, the sentence that almost wasn't said. He thought about his mother on the phone every Sunday, asking the same question, always slightly disappointed by the same answer. He wished she could have heard this one. He stood at the window for a while longer. Then he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and made 2 cups of tea because Patricia was coming over at 8 and she took it strong with 1 sugar, and he had learned, without being asked, to have it ready. Outside, the street was doing its evening thing. Traffic, voices, the bus long gone. Inside, the wooden box sat on the shelf with 2 pieces of paper in it, a card and a letter, cream-colored, slightly faded, connected by a decade, and a door, and the patient, ongoing act of one person choosing to see another. The kettle boiled. James poured the tea. The story moved on.